Welcome to This Day in His Story, created by American Heritage Worldwide. A reminder that every day holds something new to learn. Did you know that the Stamp Act was a way to make colonists pay for the costly 7 Years' War every time they bought newspapers, pamphlets, playing cards, almanacs, and even dice? Learn how the colonists had to buy official stamps and place them on every document to make them legally valid. Discover that to keep the stamps from being reused, an image of King George's coat of arms was on the back of the stamp. Learn that, as a result, a common unity of purpose and rebellion formed among the colonists, encouraging them to protest and fight for independence.
Imagine waking up today, grabbing your keys, and walking down to your local bookstore. You're just, looking for a bit of light reading.
Right.
So you pick up a standard, 35-page magazine. You head over to the register, you pull out your wallet, and the cashier looks you dead in the eye and says, "That'll be $5 for the magazine and $293 for the tax."
Which is just insane.
Right. You would probably think it was a hidden camera prank. Or, honestly, more likely, you just laugh, drop the magazine on the counter, and walk right out of the store.
Yeah.
But what if you couldn't just walk away?
Yeah, what if you had no choice?
Exactly. What if that kind of suffocating, completely invisible markup was suddenly attached to almost every single piece of paper you needed to, legally and functionally live your life?
I mean, it would completely paralyze you. It would just freeze the daily functions of an entire society, from the highest courts all the way down to the local taverns. And, well, historically speaking, we don't just have to guess what that looks like.
Because it actually happened.
It did exactly that.
Which brings us to our mission for today's deep dive. We are exploring a fascinating intersection of historical data, economic analyses, and some pretty deep philosophical arguments surrounding one specific, incredibly volatile event.
The Stamp Act of 1765.
Yes, the Stamp Act. Our goal today is to understand how a seemingly simple tax, on paper, what was really just supposed to be a standard bureaucratic revenue stream, accidentally became the ultimate explosive catalyst for American colonial unity.
And to really grasp the magnitude of this, we have to set the geopolitical stage a bit.
Please do.
So the date is March 22, 1765. The British Parliament is staring down a massive, existential financial crisis.
Because of the war, right?
Exactly. They have just emerged from the 7 Years' War with France, which was essentially the first truly global conflict. They had to fund massive naval fleets, supply armies across entire oceans, subsidize their European allies. Because of all this, the British Empire is practically drowning in debt.
Just totally tapped out.
Completely. The treasury is depleted, and the citizens back in England are already taxed to the absolute breaking point. So Parliament needs revenue, and they need it fast.
And they start looking across the ocean.
Right. They look across the Atlantic at the 13 prosperous colonies. Colonies that, at least in the eyes of the British, just benefited immensely from British military protection during the war.
So it's time to pay the piper.
That's the logic. Consequently, for the very first time, Parliament decides to levy a direct tax on the American colonists. Not a trade tariff on imports like they were used to, but a direct, unavoidable tax on the internal daily life of the colonies.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the implementation is just wild to me. Out of all the things to tax in a burgeoning, resource-rich new world, they had vast amounts of timber, they had endless tracts of land, incredibly lucrative fur trade.
Oh, massive amounts of resources.
Why paper? Why did the greatest empire in the world zero in on court documents and almanacs to solve a global debt crisis?
Well, because paper is the absolute unavoidable lifeblood of a functioning legal and commercial system.
Huh.
Think about it. You can hide a bundle of fur pelts from a tax collector. You can, smuggle a barrel of molasses into a hidden cove in the dead of night.
Right. Smuggling was huge back then.
Huge. But you cannot hide a legally binding contract. If you are buying land to farm, if you are defending your property in court, or if you're transferring wealth to your children, you need a recognized official piece of paper.
And the British knew that.
They absolutely knew that. They realized that by taxing the paper itself, they were essentially installing a mandatory toll booth on the entire colonial economy. You simply could not participate in civil society without paying their toll.
And the mechanics of this toll booth, the sheer staggering bureaucracy of it, is almost hard to wrap your head around today.
Oh, it was a nightmare.
Looking at the actual legislation from our sources, it wasn't just a flat, simple fee. The act taxed everything in like granular detail. Court papers, commercial contracts, property leases, bills of sale.
Yeah, they didn't miss a thing.
There was even a highly specific, frankly bizarre bracket just for property transfers of more than 200 acres, but not more than 320 acres.
Right. The granularity of the law was intense. It was designed to capture every single level of wealth transfer. And the enforcement mechanism they designed was entirely draconian.
What happened if you didn't have the stamp?
If your document did not feature the official government stamp, it was entirely unenforceable in a court of law. It literally didn't legally exist.
Wow.
Worse, you were subject to severe legal penalties just for attempting to use an unstamped document. By denying the stamp, you were effectively stripped of your rights and legal protections as a subject of the empire.
And getting that stamp wasn't cheap or easy. The base cost for many of these stamps was 2 shilling, 6 pence.
Which is a lot.
Yeah. To put that in perspective for you, a 2 shilling coin was equal in value to 1/10 of pound sterling, which was a significant sum for an everyday colonist. But the physical application of the stamp, that's where it turns into a total bureaucratic nightmare.
The vellum.
Yes, the vellum. For ordinary everyday paper, the stamp was simply embossed directly onto it. But for vellum, which is what they used for the really important generational legal documents, it became a mess. Vellum was made from calfskin, and it's naturally quite oily.
Exactly. Calfskin does not hold a dry, embossed stamp well at all. The impression just fades right away.
So they couldn't just stamp it?
No. So Parliament mandated this ridiculously convoluted workaround. To stamp a vellum document, the impression first had to be made onto a completely separate piece of beige or dark blue paper.
Okay.
Then, that specific colored piece of paper had to be physically glued and fastened onto the vellum document.
It's so frustrating just picturing some poor colonial clerk having a mess with glued colored paper just to finalize a simple lease.
And the government didn't stop there.
Of course they didn't.
No, they didn't. What's fascinating here is the anti-fraud mechanism they built into this cumbersome process. Parliament knew people would try to cheat the system.
By reusing the stamps.
Exactly. To prevent someone from simply peeling that glued stamped paper off an expired old contract and slapping it onto a newly drafted one to avoid paying the tax again, the back of the stamped paper was printed with a highly detailed coat of arms of King George III.
You know, when we examine this process, it instantly reminds me of the most frustrating aspects of modern digital anti-piracy measures.
Oh, like DRM?
Yes. It's exactly like when you legitimately purchase a piece of software, but you still have to navigate a labyrinth of digital rights management hoops.
Right, you have to prove you bought it.
Right. You have to create an account, connect to a remote server, verify your identity, enter a 16-digit code. It is highly visible, incredibly annoying friction inserted directly into your transaction.
And it doesn't help the user at all.
Exactly. It provides absolutely zero value to you as the user.
Nope.
It exists purely as a bureaucratic hoop designed to prove to the entity in charge that you paid your dues. That's exactly what this vellum and glue coat of arms nonsense was. It was a 1765 DRM system, and it was infuriating.
That is a very apt analogy. It was asymmetrical friction. But, you know, the friction of the glue and the vellum was nothing compared to the actual economic burden.
Right.
The annoyance of the bureaucracy was one thing, but the sheer cost of the tax was economy crushing.
Let's translate that cost into something we can understand today. Because if we adjust those 1765 taxes into modern 2015 dollar equivalents, based on our source data, the sticker shock is very real. I want to hand this over to you, because when I saw these numbers, my jaw hit the floor.
Yeah, the numbers are staggering when contextualized for a modern audience.
Yep.
We mentioned that 35-page magazine at the top of our discussion.
Right, the hypothetical bookstore trip.
So the legislation imposed a tax of 1 shilling per page plus an additional 2 shillings for every single advertisement printed in it.
Okay.
So a 35-page magazine featuring 10 ads translates to $293.56 in tax alone.
$293 for a magazine. I mean, that completely prices out the average citizen from participating in the exchange of public ideas.
It prices them out of almost every avenue of upward mobility. Listen to the equivalents for advancing in life. Getting a diploma just graduating, and obtaining the physical proof of your education.
How much?
It would cost you the equivalent of $234.84 in taxes.
Wow.
A business license printed on vellum, $117.42.
That's a huge barrier to entry for a small business.
It is. But they didn't just target the professional and academic classes. Even basic leisure was penalized. A simple deck of playing cards carried a $5.87 tax.
For cards?
Yeah. And a pair of dice cost $58.72.
Wait, nearly $60 just for a pair of dice? That feels intensely punitive. They are completely pricing the working class out of basic tavern entertainment.
Well, the tax on dice and cards is particularly revealing about the pervasive nature of the legislation. Dice and cards represent everyday entertainment and often untaxed gambling.
Ah, gambling.
Right. By taxing these specific items so aggressively, the British were making sure they hit absolutely everyone. They hit the wealthy merchants with the property transfers, they hit the lawyers with the court documents, and they hit the everyday laborers in their local taverns in their moments of leisure. Absolutely no one was exempt from feeling the financial sting.
It's literally everywhere. Even a basic calendar carried a tax of nearly $2. But, as we dig into the historical economic data provided in our sources, there's one detail that made me stop and push back a little bit.
Oh, what's that?
The figures show that sugar carried a whopping $130 tax equivalent.
Right.
Wait a minute. Wasn't this specifically legislation focused on paper documents?
Yeah.
Why is sugar showing up in this list of economic grievances?
That's a vital catch, and it points to the larger historical context. The Stamp Act itself was indeed entirely focused on paper, but the inclusion of the massive sugar tax in the historical economic analyses highlights the broader compounding reality of British taxation at the time.
Okay, so it wasn't just the Stamp Act.
Right. Specifically, it points to the Sugar Act, which was passed just prior to the Stamp Act.
Ah, so this is illustrating a cumulative snowball effect.
Exactly.
It's showing us that the British revenue attempts weren't isolated incidents. They were bleeding into every single corner of colonial life. If you want to sweeten your tea in the morning, boom, you're hit. If you want to read a political pamphlet in the afternoon, you're hit. If you want to play a game of dice in the evening, you're hit. It must have felt incredibly suffocating.
Suffocating is exactly the right word. You have to consider the environment here. You are taking an infant, sparsely settled continent that relies heavily on localized barter and trade.
They didn't have a lot of cash floating around.
Right, hard currency is already scarce.
No.
And you are extracting its wealth at every possible touch point of daily existence. When you aggressively tax a population to the point where reading a basic calendar or signing a standard lease becomes an absolute luxury, a massive explosive reaction isn't just likely.
It's guaranteed.
It is a historical inevitability.
And the powder keg absolutely explodes. What's amazing when looking at the historical timeline is that the avalanche of colonial protests caught the British completely off guard.
They had no idea.
They just did not see this level of outrage coming.
No, they profoundly miscalculated the colonial identity and really the political philosophy brewing across the Atlantic. The colonists passionately believed in their rights as Englishmen.
Right.
And a fundamental non-negotiable tenet of that identity was the belief that you could only be taxed by your own consent, granted through localized representative assemblies.
No taxation without representation.
Exactly.
Which brings us to figures like John Adams. According to the sources, he drafted a set of resolutions in his hometown of Braintree, Massachusetts.
Yeah.
And he didn't just complain about the money.
No, he went much deeper.
Right. He didn't just call it a burdensome tax that caused embarrassments to business. He went straight for the constitutional jugular. He argued that the entire framework was fundamentally unconstitutional because no free man should ever be subject to a tax to which he hasn't given his direct consent, either in person or by a chosen proxy.
And that argument provided the crucial intellectual and philosophical foundation of the resistance. It shifted the narrative from a simple economic complaint to a defense of fundamental human rights.
It raised the stakes.
It really did. But those elevated intellectual arguments in the town halls quickly gave way to visceral physical reality on the cobblestone streets.
Exactly. First, it started as an outright widespread refusal to use the stamps. People simply ignored the law and operated without them.
Which was dangerous.
Very. But then the temperature rose. We see full-blown riots, the literal burning of the stamped paper in the public squares.
And it gets worse.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the resistance stops being just a spontaneous, chaotic mob and becomes a highly organized, strategic machine. In the summer of 1765, we see the formation of the Sons of Liberty.
And they did not play nice.
No, they didn't.
They recognized that polite petitions were easily ignored in London, so they escalated their tactics dramatically. They began systematically targeting the colonial stamp agents, the local men hired to distribute the paper.
The middle managers.
Exactly. They tarred and feathered them in the streets. They attacked the private homes and the commercial warehouses of the wealthy elites who supported the British policy.
That's terrifying.
It was a campaign of absolute calculated intimidation, and it worked flawlessly. By early 1766, almost all of the stamp distributors had resigned out of sheer terror for their lives and property.
You know, examining the Sons of Liberty, targeting these specific local stamp distributors, it feels very much like a historical version of decentralized asymmetrical warfare.
How do you mean?
Well, it's like a modern coordinated internet campaign, like a doxing effort. Instead of trying to sail across the ocean and take on the entire British Parliament directly, which would be impossible, they identify the local guys.
The ones within reach.
Right. They expose them locally, they show up at their homes, and they apply so much targeted, decentralized pressure that the people enforcing this system find their lives socially and physically unbearable. They are forced to step down. It's incredibly messy, it's deeply intimidating, but as a tactic to break a bureaucratic system from the inside out, it's ruthlessly effective.
That's a very sharp way to analyze their methodology. It was indeed asymmetrical warfare applied directly to civil bureaucracy, and it was fueled by a very clear, very public existential dread.
Yeah, they felt their way of life was ending.
Absolutely. We see accounts of one massive angry mob marching through the streets of New York carrying a large banner that simply read, "The folly of England, the ruin of America."
Wow.
They don't just see this as bad tax policy, they saw it as the beginning of the end of their freedom.
So you have the streets in chaos, you have the king's stamp agents running for the hills, and the system is physically broken. But street riots alone don't usually change international maritime law. It was organized political unity and severe economic pressure that finally forced Britain's hand.
Precisely. The violence got attention, but the organization forced action. In October of 1765, representatives from 9 different culturally distinct colonies convened in New York for what became known as the Stamp Act Congress.
Which was a big deal.
You have to understand how difficult this was. These colonies often operated like entirely separate countries with different economies, different religious majorities, frequent border disputes. Getting 9 of them into one room to draft formal resolutions of rights and grievances and petition King George III was a monumental achievement in diplomacy.
Which Parliament immediately and predictably rejected.
They did, but the colonists had a secondary strategy that was much more persuasive than a polite petition.
The boycotts.
Right. They hit the British Empire where it hurt the most, the transatlantic supply chain. Massive protests at the colonial seaports completely disrupted the import and export of goods. Organized mobs turned away incoming British ships, flat out refusing to let them unload their manufactured cargo.
So suddenly, wealthy British merchants and manufacturers back in England are losing an absolute fortune.
Right.
They have warehouses full of goods they can't sell. They start panicking and begging Parliament for immediate relief. The economic pressure travels right back across the Atlantic, and it actually works. By early 1766, the Stamp Act is officially repealed.
It was.
That sounds like a massive, unequivocal victory for the colony.
It was a victory, yes, but one that came with a massive, carefully laid geopolitical trap.
Huh?
Parliament repealed the Stamp Act largely to appease their own bleeding merchants, but they couldn't afford to look weak on the global stage. If they admitted that a colonial mob could nullify parliamentary law, they feared the entire empire would unravel.
They had to save face.
Exactly. So, in the exact same breath as the repeal, they issued the Declaratory Act. This new act explicitly asserted that the British Parliament had the absolute, unquestionable right to direct taxation anywhere within the empire, quote, in all cases whatsoever.
Wow. So they are basically saying, okay, we're taking away this specific paper tax because it's causing a headache for our merchants, but don't get it twisted for a second. We own you, and we have the sovereign right to tax you however and whenever we want.
Exactly. It was a chilling, sweeping statement of absolute authority designed to save face, and the colonists saw right through the political theater.
They weren't fooled.
Not at all. They recognized that the Stamp Act wasn't just an isolated administrative mistake. It was part of a broader, gradual plot to permanently deprive them of their freedoms. Because of this realization, the seaport mobs didn't just pack up and go home. The tension remained, and they continued to turn away British ships.
The fire was already lit.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, That Stamp Act Congress, bringing 9 completely distinct, often squabbling colonies into one room to agree on a unified petition, that served as the exact blueprint for the Continental Congress a decade later.
You'll just practice.
Exactly. The British, in their attempt to extract wealth, accidentally taught the colonies exactly how to communicate, organize, and work together. They proved to the colonists that their individual regional grievances were actually a shared continental grievance, and that a shared grievance required a shared, united response.
Now, as we move through the historical timeline presented in our sources, the discussion surrounding these events takes a fascinating turn into a much deeper philosophy of taxation itself.
It does.
We've established the historical mechanics, but we need to look at the psychological and moral arguments of the time. Now, we want to be clear. We are just exploring the viewpoints presented in the source text here.
Right, impartial reporting of their ideas.
Exactly. It's generally acknowledged that taxes are fundamentally needed to provide basic public services, to build roads, and to fund courts. That's the basic social contract of living in a society. But the source points out that throughout human history, sovereign rulers have frequently abused this power to unfairly burden their people.
Yes, it highlights the age-old inherent tension between civic duty and state overreach. At what specific point does contributing to the public good cross the line into being actively exploited by the sovereign?
And the philosophical perspective we are examining actually leans into a very specific religious and moral lens to explore this boundary.
Oh, the biblical reference.
Yeah, it pulls a conceptual framework from the biblical text of 1 Corinthians 13, verse 1, which discusses the nature of charity and love. It outlines a fascinating argument that demanding money through oppressive, inescapable taxation is inherently the opposite of a charitable act.
It's an interesting framing.
The argument in the source posits that forced extraction actually demeans the giver, stripping away their moral agency, and removes the foundational act of love and choice from the concept of charity.
It's a profound shift in perspective. It frames taxation not just as a cold economic transaction, but as a deeply moral one. The core of the argument is that true societal value and virtue come from the generous, voluntary giving of our surplus to help our community.
Voluntarily.
Right. When the state violently extracts that surplus, like demanding $293 for a magazine under the strict threat of legal penalty in prison, it strips the individual of their moral agency. You aren't choosing to help. You are being coerced under threat of ruin.
I do have to push back a little on this leak, though. I want to ask you, looking at this purely objectively,
Sure.
is it intellectually fair to compare a modern state's macro tax policy, which is designed to fund complex infrastructure like navies, border defense, a judiciary, directly to the ancient biblical concept of interpersonal voluntary charity? Aren't those two entirely different frameworks of human interaction?
That's a very valid critique. It is a highly subjective argument made by the source. Treating complex public policy and interpersonal charity as identical frameworks completely ignores the massive scale and logistical complexity of managing a nation-state.
Right.
You simply cannot crowdfund a global navy or maintain a functional Supreme Court through spontaneous acts of interpersonal goodwill. However, analyzing this argument objectively for what it reveals about the mindset of the 18th century colonist is absolutely crucial.
Ah, I see.
The colonists viewed their property, their labor, and their community giving through a deeply moral and often highly religious lens. To them, the state stepping in and forcing extraction wasn't just a matter of bad economic policy. It was felt as a direct infringement on their spiritual and moral autonomy.
It was personal.
Highly personal. It's less about whether the analogy holds up perfectly to modern economic theory and much more about understanding how viscerally and personally they felt violated by the Crown's actions. That makes a lot of sense when you put it in that historical context.
Yeah.
It explains the sheer emotional intensity of the riots. It wasn't just about losing a few shillings. It was about the fundamental existential right to choose what to do with the fruits of your own hard labor.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean?
Well, synthesizing all of this, it means that the Stamp Act stands as one of history's greatest, most consequential miscalculations.
An epic backfire.
Unbelievably so.
Mm-hmm.
Here was a piece of legislation designed simply to patch a hole in the budget and pay off a war debt. But its execution was so heavy-handed, so bureaucratically pervasive, and so economically suffocating across all classes that it achieved the exact opposite of its intended goal.
It united them.
Right. Instead of quietly filling the British treasury, it birthed a unified, highly organized American resistance. It definitively proved that shared grievances, especially when they strike directly at people's wallets, their daily routines, and their moral agency, are an unstoppable unifying force. I want you to think about that profound realization as you go about your week. Think about the invisible costs, the embedded taxes, and the subtle friction in your own daily transactions today.
The modern toll booths.
Exactly. The endless digital subscriptions, the local sales taxes, the processing fees. How much friction do you tolerate just to participate in modern life? And considering the deep philosophical challenge raised in our discussion today regarding moral agency, I challenge you to make a plan to perform one truly charitable act of kindness for someone else this week that doesn't involve money at all.
I like that.
Just your time, your energy, and your own voluntary agency.
And as you do, I want to leave you to consider this final, lingering, historical what if. Imagine if the British Parliament had simply swallowed their imperial pride, accepted the economic loss of the boycott, and never followed the repeal of the Stamp Act with that heavy-handed, face-saving declaratory act.
They just let it go.
Right. If they had just let the issue die. Would those 13 distinct, culturally separate, endlessly squabbling colonies have ever found a strong enough reason to unite? Or would the map of North America look completely different today?
It really makes you wonder just how close we came to a totally different world. And to think, all that massive global change was sparked by a simple tax on a piece of paper. The next time you buy a magazine, just be glad the sticker price is the actual price.
Thank you for joining us for this day in His story. May the lessons of yesterday inspire you to see God's hand today and to play your part in His story now. For more faith-based learning, visit ahsworldwide.org, the homeschool for faith and family.